Okay, so I'm gonna start recording, and then does anybody have any questions before we get started today? Any questions on anything? Everybody's doing good? He's following along, understanding R as best as you can at this point. Okay. All right, so what I'm going to do today is introduce something new with R. It's called a ggplot, and I'm going to be kind of sharing a couple things. There is a syntax file. It's called ggplot intro. And so if you want to follow along on R or on RStudio, feel free to download that. If not, I'm recording, so you can go ahead and just kind of watch this a little bit later. ggplot is another type. It's another kind of language for R that does a little bit more advanced kinds of graphics. And there's a few graphics that we do later on that ggplot just does better. ggplot just does a lot of things better. And so I want to kind of teach you this kind of way in which we do graphics. It's not mentioned much in the book, but there are, if you want a little bit more information, I can give you, there's some online resources that are really helpful for ggplot, in addition to the syntax that I'll be sharing with you, of course, and then as we go on, of course, I'll be sharing the code, and so you should be pretty ready to go. See, as always, feel free to break in, because sometimes I'll miss a chat, if you say something in the chat, or I won't be able to see everybody once I share my screen. So feel free to just kind of interrupt rudely as you're kind of starting, as we get kind of started with things, just as a way to kind of help figure things out. Okay, so ggplot, what is ggplot? So we've done a lot of graphics so far, and it's basically been kind of, it's like the histogram and other things that we've done. It's that kind of command set. What ggplot does is does something similar, but has kind of a different sort of setup. So first off, there's a couple different packages that you need to load. Okay, so when we go over here to packages, the first thing that you need to make sure that you have highlighted is one called tidyverse. So you see tidyverse right here. And tidyverse is a package of kind of, it's actually several different packages. So you can see these packages, ggplot, tibble, tighter, per, so on and so forth. We don't use all of these. One we're using today, obviously, is a ggplot. So you want to make sure to definitely click this so that you can have, you can't use ggplot until you have added this package. You can also add the ggplot package directly if you're only working with that for some reason. Either way is fine. I find it's easier just to load the entire, what's known as the tidyverse, as a way to kind of go through it. It just makes it easier. But here again, it's kind of up to you. The second thing that we need is a package called mosaic data. Mosaic data. So type in mosaic data. And this is a package. This is basically kind of a package of example data sets. And one of these data sets that we'll be using today is a part of this particular package. So make sure if you're practicing this on your own, that you click both the tidyverse and the mosaic data to add that in. Okay, so a couple things to know here that we've kind of done before. First, I'm going to use the head command to look at this a particular data set. So CP85, notice how it comes up. So I can add that in, and basically we have several different variables here: wage, education, race, sex, ethnicity, South, married, all these different things. Now, one thing you can do is, if you're working with a data set and it's kind of a part of one of these packages, you can type in the question mark and then type in the data set that you're working with. So CPS, oops. So notice how the CPS 85 comes up there. I can click that. And then notice under help, it brings up this particular data set. So this is data from a 1985 current population survey. And then we can look through and it'll tell me the variables, wage, education, how each of those variables are measured, so on and so forth. So anytime you're working with a data set that's kind of preset as a part of a package, or even if it's a part of R, you can use that question mark and it will give you information about that data set. You can also use it for different kinds of functions. So remember yesterday we were working with histograms. If you type in that question mark and then HIST, it'll give you information about the histogram. And it'll give you some, it's basically kind of like a dictionary of different sorts of things. Okay, so questions here so far. Anybody have any questions? Okay, so I'm looking right here, and what I'm going to talk about first is this is the basic code for a ggplot, the basic code for a ggplot. And what that is it's the basic formula that you use in order to talk about the ggplot. And so there's a few different things we use. You have the data, which is going to be the data set that you're looking at. You have what's called the geom function. And the geom function is basically the shape or the graphic you're going to use to describe your data set. So you can use geom point, which is what we're going to be doing today, which is basically a point. You can use geom bar, which is basically a bar graph. And then there's several other types of geoms. And that's essentially just the graphic you're using to actually represent your data. Finally, the mappings, which are here, and the mappings are typically going to be whatever variables you're looking at. So it's typically you're going to specify what your X variable is or your Y variable is, and that's typically specifying what's going on in each of the axes. So the setup here, if you can look right here, we have ggplot, then you put in the data. Then I have that geom, a geom function that I'm going to use, followed by the mapping, and we use this little AES, or the aesthetic, and that's where I'm going to specify what variables I'm going to be looking at. The other nice thing about ggplot is that basically as you add elements to ggplot, you simply add in the plus sign. So each time I add something new, I add some other detail, I make it, basically you make the graphs kind of look better, I add a plus sign and then add some other new code to improve that particular graph. Okay, so let's start here. So step one, when you're doing a ggplot, is you specify the data. So I'm going to type in ggplot. Notice how it pops up. So just like other commands that we use, then I'm going to specify the data. So data equals, and then I'm looking at this CPS 85. And so that is step one. Now, if you notice, what comes up here on the right is, of course, nothing. Now, and that's because we haven't specified the other things we need for a plot. So step one, though, you need the data, but then in order to actually produce the graph, I'm going to need to add more information. So here, step two is where you identify your geom. So let's go ahead and do that. So we have ggplot. And then we have, then we have our data. And the CPS 85. And then we do that plus. And then we're going to add in geom point, because we're using points. We're going to use little dots to describe this data. And then the mapping we're going to use is this AES, and then we're going to look at X is going to be equal to experience, how much experience you have, and then Y is going to be equal to wage. And then I click enter. And notice how I get my graph. So this is a geom plot. This is what's known as a scatter dot sort of graph. It's a graph we use a lot with correlations and with regressions. And it's basically kind of mapping wage with experience. So it's the years of experience that someone has. Each dot represents the years of experience that someone has with what their wage is. Okay, any questions there so far? Okay, now one thing that's kind of limiting my graph is notice way up here, I've got this kind of single dot, and this is what we would call a outlier. We kind of talked a little bit about outliers on Tuesday. It's some kind of point that doesn't really fit with the rest of the data. So to make my graph better, what I want to do is exclude that particular data point. So to do that, I'm going to enter in, I'm going to basically create another data set. I'm going to call it plot data. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to filter this particular data set by a particular variable. So I'm going to filter CPS, so CPS 85. I'm going to filter it by wage being greater than 40. Okay, so I enter that in, and notice how plot data is added up to my global environment. So that's now it's a new data set. And what I've done is I've filtered out that particular setup. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go right back to the data I was working with before, but now I'm going to change the data set to this plot data. I'm going to run it again. And then notice how I've gotten rid of that a particular outlier. And now I have kind of a better representation of these two particular variables. So it's the same thing. I just kind of changed the data, or I'm sorry, I filtered out part of the data to get rid of that particular outlier. Now there's the second way that you can do ggplots. Sometimes you want to have your variables specified in each one of the additional commands that you do. Other times you want to have it just kind of be the same variables with each command or with each additional thing you add to your ggplot. So a second way that you can do a ggplot is to type in, whoops, plot. And then I use my same data, or well, see, this time I'll use the data that I filtered, so that plot data. But now what I want to tell R is that I'm going to use the same mapping for each one of my additional functions in ggplot. So mapping is going to be that AES. And I'm going to specify here once again, X equals experience. And Y equals wage. And then I'm going to add that geom point. So that way, it's just a different way, and then I can add in different elements, but notice how I get basically the same type of graph. The graph is essentially the same. So it's another way to just kind of add in, it's another way that you can go about doing things with the graph. Now, one of the reasons that we use this particular type of graph is because you can add different elements by using that plus sign. You can add more code, which adds in and can make your graph look that much better. So for example, we can modify the look of the points. So let's go back and do that same sort of thing. Let's go back and use the graph that we were using. This time what I'm going to do is whoops. So then I'm going to do this geom point. And now I can add in things like color equals. And so I'm going to do what's called cornflower blue. And then I'm also going to add in alpha, which is going to give me a different kind of dot. And I'm going to change the size. So notice how I have kind of these slightly different sorts of dots. They're kind of somewhat more transparent. I'm using this different kind of color, and then the size is a little bit bigger. And so what that allows us to do is, as we're doing these kind of graphs, is we can kind of play around with the different sizes, different shapes, and it allows us to kind of look a little bit, to kind of modify the look at our graph and make it look better, essentially. So I can go back to this same command. Let's say that I want to do red instead of blue. I want to make this alpha 5, and I want to make the size 2. Whoops. I'm going to have to do that again. Yeah, it's giving me that geom point, but I've got to go back to my original ggplot. And then let's change the color to red. Change this alpha. Yeah, so I've just kind of changed, and so you can kind of play around and you can get it to be the look that you really want it to actually be. Now, the other thing that we often do, or that we want to do with these kinds of graphs, is we want to add in what's called a line of best fit, or a regression line. One of the things that we do when we're doing like a correlation between two variables, or we're looking at the relationship between two variables, is we often use a line to help us understand the relationship between those two variables. And the line kind of shows us what that relationship actually looks like. So in this case, what I want to do is I want to add this kind of second geom, this what's known as geom smooth. And what that allows me to do is to add a line to this particular graph. So in this case, let's go back and add that. And then the geom point. And then I want to add in, finally, this geom smooth. And then basically I'm specifying the method of the line I want to add. In this case, it's a linear model. I can enter that. And notice how I now have a line added to my graph. Now, at this point, the line basically adds what are known as confidence intervals, which we'll kind of talk about a little bit later. Don't need to worry about that. See, at this point. But another way that I can kind of change what it is that I'm doing is I can add this this other command of a confidence interval being false or standard error is equal false, and then through that I can just show the line and not also show those of particular confidence intervals. So let's go back to where we started with this ggplot, the data, and then we're going to add in the geom point. That, and then we're going to add in the line, but we want to add in this other command of se equals false. So notice here again that now I've removed that kind of those confidence intervals to the line. Okay, let's see, any questions so far? One thing to remember is that, as I'm going through, notice that I'm adding in these pluses. It's better, I think, to actually do this up here in your script area, write out the script first, and then go ahead and run the code. I've been doing it as a way to just kind of show how to enter it in. But of course, the other thing you can do is, for example, anytime you want to run something that's in your script, you just take your cursor and you put it at the back, at the end of the code that you want to run. And then for the Mac, you just hit Command Return, and it'll run all that code that you just entered in. So notice how I just kind of popped in and added in. And so I went back. So the best way, I think it's really important, and I would kind of say this is kind of a good practice to do, is as you're doing your homework or as you're writing out, like even your quizzes, go ahead and just write out a script for each one of those. And then you can work out the code here. And then also allows you to kind of put different levels to your code, which makes it a little bit easier to actually enter in, and that makes it easier to kind of look at and understand what you're doing. Okay. All right, so questions here. Okay, so the next thing that we can do is we can actually split this, but we can show this particular scatter plot by a categorical variable. I mean, we can, on Tuesday we were talking about the Jiminy Cricket data set and talking about either wishing upon a star or focusing on hard work. And you can do a similar thing with a scatter plot, but you can actually show the scatter based on that variable. And you can show it based on a categorical variable, basically a variable that consists of categories. So to do that, well, let's see, what you do is, let's see, I think that's going to run that on a Mac. Yeah, so notice that I've created this scatter plot, and now I've applied it to males and to females. So the males are in this green, and it kind of just automatically chooses that. And then the females are actually in the red. Now, what's important to kind of notice is the way that I did that is I added color. See where it says color equals sex? What that's doing is it's adding a third variable, And it's basically it's a splitting variable that's splitting these two, or the relationship between these two, by this third variable, which is sex or gender. So when you do that, it kind of adds in and adds a little bit more detail. And what this actually shows is that for males, there's actually slightly more of a relationship between the amount of between the years of experience that they have and their wage, whereas that relationship is actually not as strong for females. And so, of course, so once again, this teaches us something really helpful about this particular data set. Now, the final thing that you can do with this type of graph is you can add what are called labels or labs. And so labs basically stands for labels. And that's a way that you can enter in labels for each of these things that I'm looking at. So let's go ahead and do this kind of all at once. So first off, let's kind of review. I can do ggplot. And I can use, here's my data that I'm going to use, which is that plot data. So I have that in. And then second, I do this mapping. And that's going to be this AES. And then X is going to be equal to experience. And Y is going to be equal to wage. But then I'm adding in this third variable. So I want it to be colored based on sex, or in this case, a gender. So then from here, now here, hold on one second. Oh, good, yeah. It might be a little bit easier to see that way. Now, anytime that you're going to add more code, but you're kind of running out of room, now technically you could just string this all along, but then it gets a little bit harder to see. So anytime you're kind of running out of room for something, just hit plus, and it'll kind of continue it on the next line. So now I want to do the geom point. That's going to be this alpha equals 0.7. And the size is equal to 3. So here again, I hit plus, and it's going to add it to, the next line. So now I'm going to do this geom smooth, and that's where I'm going to get my line. So method is going to be the linear model. And I am going to remove the confidence intervals. SE equals false. Then I'm actually going to even, I can actually even change the size of the line itself. So size equals 4.5. Okay. So then I go plus again. Notice how it pops me down. And now I'm going to do labs. And so this is where I'm going to do my labels. So I'm going to start off with the title, wages and experience, gender. And anytime you want to do, anytime you're using titles or labels, you want to make sure that they're in quotation marks. And then I want X to equal years of experience. Y is going to be equal to hourly wage. So now notice that I've created, here's my title, wages and experience by gender. Now I have the hourly wage. So it's replaced that initial, the initial variable name that we took from the data set. Now I'm just kind of giving something that's more descriptive. Then I have years of experience. and I'm showing that same data as before. And notice how here again, the nice thing about ggplots is that notice how I can add in all these different elements. And as you learn how to use ggplot, you learn how to make better and better graphs. Because this graph has a lot more detail. It looks a lot better than some of those earlier graphs because there's kind of, I can do a lot more with it in that sense. Let's see. Okay, so questions here. One thing to remember too, as you're learning to do these things is feel free to just kind of take this code and you can cut and paste. Like if I was going to do my own, because a lot of times what I'll ask you to do, like for quizzes and for homework assignments, is to kind of take a secondary data set and to create a graph like these kinds. And the easiest way to do that is just to go ahead and open a new script. So here's the script we're going to do it. And then you can say, here you can, oops. I think my computer's getting a little slow. Oh, there you go. That's good. You can add in, so here's my new graph. And then the easiest way to do it, I think, is just grab all this code, copy it, and then you can bring it over to your new script. And then what you do from there is just change whatever data set that you're using, type in the new data set, then change whatever the variables that you're using, and you just retype it based on whatever it is that you're doing. As we learn to use R, all this code is going to be available to you. There's no, you don't have to type it fresh each time. I mean, I type it as a way to kind of teach and as a way to kind of give you time to kind of see what I'm doing. But the reality is that you basically just can use this code and then change whatever you want to make your graph what you want it to be. So you can change the variables, you can change the sizes if you want, and then you can change the title and the names of the variables to fit whatever it is that you're doing. And that's the reason why, these are online and set up for that, is so that you can do that and use those at any time. So don't feel like, I mean, I think it's helpful in the beginning to try to type it out, because I think it helps to give kind of a basic overview of kind of what you're doing and what you're doing with RStudio. But as the code gets a little bit more complex, I would just kind of cut and paste and then just switch the data set, switch the variable you're looking at, and then just add in the pieces as you go. And as you learn how to use RStudio more and more, I think it becomes kind of easier to do that. Let's see. All right, so any questions that you have on how to use ggplot, or anything else from your homework or anything like that so far?
On this one, if the data doesn't have an outlier, would we skip that set, or will mostly all the data have an outlier that we would work
Yeah,
with?
if it doesn't have an outlier, you don't need to do it.
Okay.
Yeah, you don't, if there's not an outlier, you don't have to find one and try to get rid of it.
No,
Yeah,
like, I don't know.
Just a step you can use.
Or like, just in case like it isn't apparent, like, would it be, just to be safe, just run it just in case?
No, because
Okay.
when you look back to that initial data set, it was very obvious. Unless you have a point that's that far off, you don't need to do it. And really, I'll tell you if there's an outlier. I mean, most of the data sets are set up that you don't need to do that for the most part.
Okay.
And if it's part of like a question on a quiz or something, then I'll tell you, hey, there's an outlier here. You should probably get rid of it. I mean, I'm not expecting you to do that at this point yet.
Okay. Sounds good. Thanks.
Yeah. Other questions? Because a lot of what we're doing is we're learning how to work with data. And so part of what I'm trying to do is to give you several tools to use. And so, sometimes there'll be data sets with an outlier, but there's plenty that don't, and you don't have to get rid of it either. I mean, it just helps, I think, make the graph look better. It doesn't necessarily, it's not like required in some way. Right, other questions that you have? All righty. So I'm going to double check the due dates on the homework, but it should be kind of similar to what we've been doing before. Then we'll have a quiz on this stuff next week. That'll be kind of our first quiz. And the quizzes from now out, so the earlier quizzes were more conceptual. Now that we're kind of mixing together the conceptual with using RStudio, the quizzes are going to shift towards being basically RStudio work. So you're going to kind of use the concepts and then kind of display your knowledge of those concepts by actually using RStudio. So that's kind of where we go on from here. And we'll start to learn more of the actual statistical tests that we'll be using. Like the t-test, like ANOVA, correlational tests, like Pearson's R, so on and so forth. So from here on out, it's going to be much more about getting a data set and running some kind of test on it. That's a lot of what we'll be doing from on out. We've got a couple more things to do with like z-scores and things, but that's kind of the direction that we're moving, if you will.
Right now that you mentioned the quizzes real quick, I don't know if it's on my end or not, but for some reason, because before, like on my dashboard, like at the bottom, like it shows you like the due dates, like I would be able to see like upcoming quiz is due on a certain date. Like I no longer see it just for this class. Like I still see all my assignments due for other classes. I don't know if it's on my end or if something changed.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'll have to take a look at it.
Okay.
I don't know. It should be coming up.
I'm seeing that as well.
It should be coming up. That's kind of interesting. It may be, I mean, it looked like it kind of changed the dates of everything and kind of made it to this quarter, but maybe it's the case that there's some dates that haven't been adjusted yet. And so that's why they're not all showing up yet.
Okay. Yeah, because it's just on my dashboard. It doesn't show like when the assignments are due, but if I go like on the Moodle page, like I can, if I click on the assignment, like I can see when it's due. But yeah.
Yeah, let me take a look. I'm not sure offhand, but I'll take a look at it.
Okay, thank you.
But you only have to worry about being like a week. I mean, as long as you're on top of things for the week, you should be in pretty good shape. I mean, most of the things are going to be based on getting stuff done that week. So you don't have to you don't have to worry about getting yourself ahead for anything.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions?